At least to this evening's lecture with Emilio Mordini and Brad Evans on Europe under threat. My name remains Peter Burgess from the Institute for European Studies and the Institute for Peace Research in Oslo, Trio. And I remind you for the last time, you probably know it by heart, that this is a collaboration between IES, PRIO, and the Center for Law, Science, Technology and Society Studies here at the VUB. And apologies, not for the last time, from Serge Gutret, who could not be here this evening. We've looked at a range of topics this semester. Just to give you a little reminder of the route we've traveled, we began with Schengen and the legal implications of immigration law. We talked about the internal-external security continuum, security technologies, which went together with a talk about Eurosur, the European surveillance system. We talked about anti-immigration strategies, together with immigration strategies. Human rights was the subject for one evening. Citizenship, again, and then religion and secularism we spoke about. Immigration policies. And the one lecture that did not happen, which should have happened, we'll catch up another time, was about policing and police methods relative to immigration issues. But then last week it was refugee management, and then this time we conclude the series with the theme, Is Europe Under Threat? Which is, in some sense, is meant to be the culmination of the series. And the topic that we'll focus on this evening is biopolitics, essentially. So governance, the governance understood now as not governing citizens, but governing populations, governing life, governing species. And to talk about this, we have two very well-known specialists on the area, Emilio Mordini and Bradley Evans. Just a word about them before we get on. Emilio Mordini is a medical doctor by training and a master of philosophy, as well as a clinical psychoanalyst, founding director of the Center for Science, Society and Citizenship, and formerly a partner of the Psychoanalytic Institute for Social Research, professor of bioethics in the Medical School of the University of Rome, member and secretary of the Bioethical Commission of the Italian National Research Council. Since 1992, he has participated or coordinated no less than 22 European Commission-funded projects in the scope of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th frameworks. He's published no less than 98 articles or monographs in peer-reviewed publications and edited 9 books. Otherwise extensively published in non-peer-reviewed journals and magazines. His talk will be entitled About Demonic Possession and Biometrics. And then we'll have Bradley Evans, who's lecturer in Global Terror in the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. He's also published widely on Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, and Agamben, and has focused on critically evaluating the liberal problematic of security, the modern propensity for violence, the politics of the event, and the ethics of difference. He's currently working on a number of projects which include, among others, a single-authored monograph entitled Terror and the Divine Economy, co-editing a book with Julian Reed of King's entitled Fascism in Deleuze and Guattari, Securitization, War and Aesthetics, working on an edited volume on Deleuze and War for the journal Theory and Event, and has edited a volume entitled Post-Intervention Societies for the Journal of Intervention and State Building. His talk will be entitled Life in Circulation. So the model will be tonight, as before, 30 to 40 minutes for each speaker, and then there'll be time for questions, comments, discussion, whatever we might find the desire and need for. So I give the floor gladly to Emilio Mordini.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening to everybody. Let me start with and apologize. I don't know if I'm going to speak of Europe under threat. Maybe there will be a lesson about the title, about the general topic of this conference, there will be a lesson that can be learned at the end of my speech. But my speech is more theoretically focused. I want to discuss with you, to think together with you, about the foundation of a technology, which is biometrics. Biometrics is a very controversial technology. And I think that for any kind of technology, we need a certain moment to take a rest and to try to understand its deep inner meanings. There are a lot of issues in the political agenda for biometrics and for other technology as well, but there is a moment to repeat in which you should understand what is a technology, what is the social function of a technology in a given society, not only to discuss the immediate political problem. So the general issue of my speech would be on biometrics and demonic possession, which is probably a bit odd, but you can see there is a logic behind. This is a famous quotation. For those of you who gave any examination on philosophy, probably this quotation is not completely new. It's from Berkeley, The Principle of Human Knowledge. Esse is percipi. Okay, this is I offered you a very rare film. It is the sole film written by Samuel Beckett in 1973 and filmed in 1964 by Alan Schneider in New York, with Buster Keaton, the man who escaped was Buster Keaton. The movie is based on that Berkeley quotation I showed you at the beginning. And the movie tells the attempts of the protagonist to escape a character who is observing him. The film consists in 3 short sequences without dialogue. The title is silent, the title of the movie. And the protagonist, Og, escapes from the gaze of Og. And the final scene takes place in Og's room. And Og's eliminate all possible source of observation, even a crack in the wall, which look like an eye. But at the very end of the film, Og, horrified, discovers that Og is still watching, because Og and Og are the same person. But what is very interesting, I want to draw your attention. Og discovers that Og is Og. It's a big difficult to follow. But we are not horrified by discovering that the other is us. Because in such a case, we still exist. What is horrible is to discover that we are the other. So we do not exist. We exist to the extent we are thought, we are perceived, we are the desire, we are the discourse, I would say Lacan, but we exist to the extent there is another. But without the other, we do not exist. This is. Because this is the experience that we are actually non-existent. So, this is the experience that the Descartes point of certainty is an illusion. You think, then I am. So, the dialectic between body and identity is at the heart of the biometric discourse. I imagine that all of you know very well what biometrics are. Let me just to remind some point. So, biometrics is the discipline of measuring relevant attributes of living individuals or population to identify active properties, unique characteristics. This is a standard definition you can find almost everywhere. And biometrics can play 2 different games. If biometrics look for pattern of change, biometrics can be used for biological research, for medical diagnosis, for clinical research. You try to understand pattern of change, if they are normal or abnormal. But you can look also for consistency, for permanence of features. In such a case, you can use this technology for recognizing, for identifying beings. It is a fictional enterprise, because no entity which is in the time can be permanent. You don't need to remember the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. It is something obvious. Everything, even a stone and a living being, more and more obviously, everything which is in time is flowing, is in continuous, ongoing change. So a technology which is based on the idea to find a permanent feature in order to identify an entity is a paradoxical technology from the very beginning. Of course, you can identify in the short term something which is permanent. But the theoretical foundation is paradoxical. And if you want to find the ancestors, the parents of biometric technology, it is not so difficult to find them in Greek philosophy. Actually, the idea that behind living beings, in the inner structure of a living being, there is a geometrical ratio. There is a mathematical structure, which is the inner reality of that being, is an idea which dates back to the 5th century before Christ, in the Greek milieu, from the Pythagorean circles and till the Plato school. But it was not a philosophical, it was not only a philosophical perspective. The whole Greek civilization in that period was obsessed by this ideal of harmony, of symmetry, of right proportion. You can see it in music with the harmonic series. You can see it in geometry with the golden section, the golden ratio. You can see it in art. Even the idea of justice in Plato is based on the idea of harmony, of symmetry. And you see, this is one of the least controversial application of biometrics for identifying wild animals, penguins. The spot on the bell of penguins are very good biometrics signature. Probably you probably ignore that one of the first large-scale application. Who knows who was the first large-scale application of biometrics in Europe? Cause, the mad cow disease. This was a technology used to trace cause and to avoid that bad illegal co-aliens from UK entered into continental Europe. But the idea that a recognition scheme based on geometry and mathematics is stronger, is more robust than other recognition scheme is a totally Neoplatonic idea. It is the idea that a knowledge based on geometry is more certain, is stronger, is deeper than any other kind of knowledge. And what is surprising is that even those critical social scientists who strongly, firstly, opposed biometrics, didn't contest the fact that biometrics is stronger and robust, more robust as identification scheme than other identification schemes. Everybody accepted this postulate. And this is exactly the postulate I don't accept. I think it is wrong, as I try to show you, if not demonstrate, at least to show with the further part of my speech. And you can see here some, of course, the focus was on the body. The biometrics body became very soon an important issue for philosophical discussion, political discussion. Probably the most famous one is Agamben's theory about argument about bare bodies. It's very, very convincing, because the point of Agamben's point is clear. Biometrics is using as an identification tools the body, while in the history of the humanity we have always used biography, history, culture. It is completely false to say, as sometimes you can listen, can hear in public, that the simplest and the easiest, the most normal way to recognize people is through body appearance. No. No one recognizes other people, but never in the history of humanity we humans have recognized other people by means of biological character features. We recognize through history. We recognize through biography. I think of one of the oldest book of Western civilization, the Iliad. There is a certain moment in the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, there is a fight between a young warrior, Glaucus, and an old, strong, important warrior, Diomedes. And the young Glaucus will be certainly killed, because he is young, he is unexperienced. And Diomedes is one of the strongest Greek warriors. And Diomedes is about to kill Glaucus. But before killing him, ask Glaucus, "Who are you?" And Glaucus, what Glaucus replies? Glaucus replied, "I'm the son of," and tell about his family. But how Glaucus started? It is very interesting. Glaucus started by saying, "We human beings are all mortals. We don't have anything. We are like leaves or flowers, vegetables that flourish in the morning and perish with the sunset." This is a metaphor, a poetic metaphor that will cross all the history of Western literature. Start there. But what is interesting? Glaucus says, "We have nothing. We mortals are nothing. We are all death. The time is over for everyone. But we have our story, our history, our biography. We have our tribe, our family." And actually, Diomedes recognized Glaucus and didn't kill him. And we are speaking of one of the oldest books of Western civilization. And recognition is already based on historical, biographical element, not on biological body element. So, Agamben is completely right. This is not going back to the past. This is completely new. We have never heard a period of human history, of human civilization, in which recognition was made only through the body. Another point, another metaphor about the biometric body was about the informatization of the body. Probably you have read various papers. It is almost a slogan, the expression informatization of the body. Biometrics turn the body into a passport. Huh? And then there is another metaphor, which is the biometrics zombies. Because if you take seriously the aphorism that biometrics turn the body into the passport, it means that there are you and the body. You have your body, which is your passport. But it means that you are not your body. Huh? So who are you? And what is the body without you? Without you? Who are you? It is very difficult to say. But what is the body without you is quite easy to say. It's a corpse. A body without a mind is a corpse. Simple. In Greek languages, there was not a word for body or for mind. The word for body, soma, that was used then for body, soma, actually meant corpse. So the zombie metaphor is a good metaphor to express what the biometric body is. Biometrics body is also a fetish. A fetish is a powerful object inhabited by a spirit. So we can answer also the question I posed. What is the biometrics body? The biometrics body is a corpse who is inhabited by you, by us, and who are you? Who are us? We are spirits, which inhabits the fetish. And all this kind of discussion end up to produce this kind of a bit emphatic statement, like the statement that you're going to read in one of the early opinion issued by an ethical national committee on biometrics, which is the French one, Biometrics Identifying Data and Human Rights. Biometrics and human dignity. You can spend through a full course, university course, to discuss biometrics and human dignity. Of course, without any practical result, but with a great satisfaction for everybody. But the point, my argument, I repeat, I have a great esteem for certain of these arguments, less for others. Probably whoever understood the arguments I like more and those I like less, but it is immaterial what I like. I want just to discuss with you the last point, which is the fact that I don't think the biometric can ensure a robust identification. Not only from a practical point of view, it doesn't, but technology can improve, so I don't want to discuss practicality. But the point is a conceptual point. Biometrics is going to identify bodies and assumes that there is a unequivocal correspondence between bodies and minds. But it is not true. It's simply false. You can have one mind and several bodies. Look at this photo. A lot of different people, you see. Girls, young people, older one. Okay, one only person. One person, different faces, different bodies. But you can have also one body, a lot of different persons. I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a psychoanalyst. I was lucky enough, because they are very rare, to have one person suffering for multiple personality disorder, and one patient suffering, I don't know if it was really suffering, from a sort of demonic possession. At least it was treated as a demonic possession by his family and the priest of the small town in South Italy where he used to live. But there is not even the need to imagine this extreme situation. If I want to change a mind without changing the body, I don't need voodoo. It is enough to use persuasion, suggestion, seduction. Today, Emilio Mordini is a pilot of an Alitalia airplane, standard flight. And Emilio Mordini has no will, no idea, no desire to destroy the airplane and to kill all passengers. But if you succeed in changing my mind, my body remains the same, but I become a fundamentalist. And tomorrow, I crash against the Twin Towers. Do you need any science fiction apparatus? Do you need any voodoo? No. You just need to convince. Persuasion. It was the old philosopher Gorgia. You can do everything through persuasion and suggestion. You just need to understand what is the right button to be pushed in each person. Of course, there are some body elements in personal identities. But what I want to tell you is that identities is not a fixed reality. Identity or a body reality. Identity concerns the whole human. You can't distinguish between mental identity, personal identity, and body identity. It is a dynamic fact. And it is an interpersonal fact. Identity is a conversation. Identity is built through conversation. And what we call, with an horrible technological term, identifiers, are languages. And there are a lot of different body languages that we use. And they convey a lot of pieces of information. And you recognize people through these languages. How we recognize people, we human beings? We recognize people by crossing sets. How you recognize me? Because you have a category: human, male, alive, Italian, middle-aged, bald, fat, unfortunately, here in this room. And then you arrive to Emilio Mordini, you cross, at a certain point you find my name. But you don't have my essence. You don't have the silver bullet, the silver bullet identifier. You extract, elicit my identity through set crossing. On the contrary, this was the dream or the nightmare of biometrics. But it is out. It is impossible. Biometrics tried to do this, but failed. And indeed, it is so true that biometrics failed, that new biometrics, second generation biometrics, are completely different. We don't have time now to discuss this. Just to show rapidly the slides we can't discuss about new generation biometrics. But what I want to tell you is that what we have discussed until now, fingerprinting, iris scanning, bare bodies, zombies, and blah, 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 is the past, is over. Okay, will be very important for the next political discussion in Europe about biometric passport. No matter. I don't want to discuss this. Probably till 2020, we will still discussing this kind of issues. But as a matter of fact, the future of this technology has nothing to do with security. Biometrics as a security technology failed. That's all. Biometrics, the destiny of this technology, if this technology goes ahead, and I hope, because I love biometrics, is completely different. Biometrics is the technology that can allow objects to recognize us. What biometrics could do is to enable the world of things to recognize human beings, individuals, which is the basic element, a building block of future ambient intelligence, smart ambience, and so on. Of course, these could have some serious political downsides, as you can see.
Under the Future Attribute Screening Technologies, or FAST program, the Department of Homeland Security is developing innovative physiological and behavioral screening technologies to streamline the screening process at security checkpoints. Something lost and never seen. Every time I start to believe. In support of this program, Battelle has partnered with industry leaders Farber Specialty Vehicles and Draper Laboratory to design and develop a portable research facility for the development and demonstration of innovative security screening technologies, the FAST Demonstration Laboratory. Something's raped and taken from me. That's gonna always be missing with me. The mobility of the FAST Demonstration Laboratory allows security officials to quickly and efficiently establish security boundaries at any location, making it useful for everything from large sporting events, border crossings, or airports. The screening mobile module provides a checkpoint to establish or supplement security facility at points of entry. At special events, attendees pass through the screening mobile module. The unique low-floor trailer design ensures accessibility for all.
Also disabled people
Inside
can access.
the screening mobile module, a suite of real-time, non-invasive sensors measure behavioral and physiological indications of malintent, or the intent or desire to cause harm. I try to every night, all in vain, in vain. Sometimes I cannot take that.
Okay. This is just to show you that the future is not obviously so pinky as I ended my previous speech, but sometimes it is worth to take the challenges. Thank you.
Right. Good, right.
Thanks for the talk, that was great. My name's Brad Evans, by the way. I'm from the University of Leeds. I think I'd like to begin by thanking Peter for inviting me here. It's obviously a distinct privilege to speak to you today. Before I begin, I do want to, I suppose, tell you a short story. Not knowing a great deal about this lecture series beforehand, I was really sort of impressed by the list of speakers that Peter sent over to me. And then a couple of days ago, I decided to get my bearings a bit about, about Brussels and find my way to the Institute and so forth. And I suddenly came across the website, and there was a bold red passage on the actual front of the website saying, "We're sorry to announce that Giorgio Agamben will not lecture on the 16th of December. Brad Evans will be speaking instead." So I think I had my own sudden productive moment of malintent, as you might explain. And I think, needless to say, since words got round, I've never had my inbox so full of good luck, you'll need it messages. So that was filling obviously Agamben's shoes. Okay, on to then Europe and the threat. Threats, of course, as many of us are aware, can register in many different ways. And it's all sort of, I suppose, rather dependent on the referent object, which is to be so secured. And I suppose the first supplementary question then that I really want to address today is what actually is Europe? I think this seems quite integral if we talk about Europe under threat. Now, perhaps most obviously, we can answer this question geopolitically. And that is to say, we could argue that Europe is first and foremost spatially determined, and hence it is a fixed, though sometimes changing, geographical entity whose modes of protection primarily rely on the policing and management of borders. So that's the familiar sort of geopolitical script, and hence security is aligned with protecting the domains of sovereign integrity. Now, whilst of course this is certainly true, I think this geopolitical perspective is only part of the story. Because the idea of Europe, I think, can also be broached biopolitically. And in that sense, what I'm talking about is that Europe can be broached to refer to a progressive account of advanced liberal life. So I think there's a biopolitical aspect to Europe as opposed to just a geopolitical aspect. And hence, from a biopolitical perspective, not only do we depend upon the deployment of more positive, sort of life-enhancing security technologies to bring about what we perceive to be certain conceptions of a good life, but this is rather aterritorial in the sense that the power and ambitions of Europe actually stretch out well beyond its borders. So I think there's a geopolitical idea of Europe, or a reality of Europe, but also a biopolitical ideal of Europe, which is very much based on life-centric, advanced notions of liberal life. Now, for the purposes of my talk today, I'm going to sort of use the two interchangeably. So when I'm discussing Europe, I will be talking about basically the defence, or the geopolitical defence, which is ultimately a system of ordering, but also the biopolitical advance, or a system of progress, of a particular, though by no means universal, say, liberal way of life. So Europe, in this sense, I think, refers to what Deleuze once called an active living space. Okay, so we can see Europe as an active living space. So taking this on board, I think the question that I really want to broach with you today is, I think, simple and yet fundamental. And that is, namely, in what sense is Europe, as a geopolitical stroke territorial and biopolitical stroke life-centric project, being threatened by the figure of the migrant? Now, at this stage, I think it's perhaps worth pointing out that in the sort of the Western political imaginary, the figure of the migrant offers to us a sort of a competing or a dualistic history, which is very much bound to the authentication of political subjectivities. For instance, one only has to look at, for instance, the stories of European migration which have come to constitute the formation of peoples, most notably the United States of America, to identify tales of heroic nomadism. And indeed, I think especially in today's so-called radically interconnected world, this spirit to roam does not follow some neat linearity between a transhuman to a sedentary existence, but the ability to traverse borders is something all of us now simply take for granted. Hence, I think Paul Virilio's claim that speed has finally conquered space is generally passed off to be one of contemporary liberal society's greatest achievements. And yet, one also finds that the migration of others narrated along altogether different lines. I think, as Michel Foucault has rightly pointed out, throughout the entire history of the colonial period, European powers were overwhelmingly concerned with disciplining and sedentarising what was perceived to be bad forms of circulation. And this goes to the heart of Foucault's notion of a liberal problematic of security, which he pinpoints to the birth of the start of the 18th century. Now, undoubtedly then, this concern with regulating the movements of what are perceived to be problematic populations, I would argue, was taken to new levels with the advent of the Palestinian refugee, who, following the formation of the State of Israel, has now become a permanent sort of feature of the modern political vernacular. And indeed, I think it's arguable that through the response to the crisis of the migrating Palestinian, that the liberal concern with regulating and managing and governing the mass exodus of populations truly begins to take its experimental shape. And this is something I will return to in a moment. So I think importantly then, we can say that the figure of the migrant can be said to offer a distinct and a variable genealogy, which at one and the same time appears to be the source of great potential optimism, but also a distinct problematic. It is of course, completely dependent on who is actually doing the migrating. Now, I think we can say, without too much controversy, that the security concerns with so-called trans-border human flows have, in the aftermath of 9/11, been largely overshadowed by the fears generated by what I have termed radical singularities. In other words, the migrant has, in more recent times, been problematised, not in terms of their capacity for mass exodus, but rather because of the minor elements which roam undetected within its midst. Thus, I would say that the radical singularities refer to those sort of unscrupulous terrorist elements whose very radical undecidability serves to heighten the political stakes of all unregulated migration more generally. And I think this is what Paul Wolfowitz unashamedly describes as a parallel globalization of terror. Okay, so it's the radical, what we don't know amongst the entire migrant population, which truly reflects badly on migration per se. However, I think whilst these concerns with the singular have really tended to dominate much of political discourse, the unbalanced focus these elements have been afforded has tended to preclude, I think, more important power dynamics and power relations, which deals with a much wider problem of those migrating populations from so-called zones of underdevelopment or crisis and so forth. I suppose it's part of my intention here then today to reinscribe the problem of the migrant as population, one whose potential capacity for mass exodus seems to also pose a fundamental problem to European security. And I think it should be added that this migrant as population is certainly far more fitting with liberal rationality and its will to rule. Liberals have, after all, found very little comfort in the overtly militaristic dimensions of the global war on terror. And hence, it is no coincidence, for instance, to find that in the post-Bush era, the figure of the terrorist has been largely displaced by the figure of the insurgent, which, as I've argued in some of my work, is equally a problem of population. So again, it's part of the liberal problematic. Okay, then, so moving on then. I think in our attempts then to map out the contemporary concerns with migrant populations, I think it's perhaps sort of pertinent for us to turn our attentions to the complex political emergencies of the 1990s. But while seeing conflict as a sort of a complex process which affected all aspects of society, was undoubtedly a catalyst for a newfound humanitarianism, which for some became sort of the hallmark of the liberal decade, it was nevertheless also driven by a concern for the displacement and the exodus of populations within and from zones of crisis. And I think we would do well, for instance, to remember that many of the so-called humanitarian agencies only decided to intervene in Rwanda once international borders had been crossed. So this then brings me, I suppose, on to the pioneering work of Mark Duffield. I'm sure some of you are obviously familiar with Mark's work. And picking up on the sort of the truism that underdevelopment is dangerous, Mark Duffield, I think, meticulously explores the power dynamics which are at play in the now well-established development-security nexus. Importantly, however, for Duffield, whilst much of our analysis has attended to the sort of the coherence of this merger between security and development, what he argues is missing out of this analytic is the considered policy of containment. Human security, thus understood, Duffield argues, is less concerned with closing the material gaps between advanced and regressive forms of life than it is with containing what could otherwise be potentially dangerous global forms of circulation. Now, the contemporary implications of Duffield's work are twofold. Firstly, for Duffield, since containing the circulatory flows of underdeveloped life is now presented to be vital for all our existence, then it's now possible, Duffield argues, to write of a global state of war or a global civil war in which policies of containment are essential to the pacification of non-liberal life. Secondly, I think this does then require us to have a far more sophisticated notion of what Agamben terms bare life. Now, as you may be aware, for Agamben, life becomes bare, that is, stripped of any political or moral claims, when it is exposed to a sovereign right to kill, what Agamben terms a death without sacrifice. Reading Duffield, however, one detects a new form of bare life, the bare life of the biopolitical encounter, which is not exposed to death. Rather, they are stripped of any moral and political claims, especially the right to flee, so that they can realise their potential for domestic sustainable salvation. A bit like what Heidegger termed life as technology. Hence, whereas bare life in the sovereign sense begins with the killing of others in order to facilitate the production of the realm's moral and political registers, bare life in a biopolitical sense begins with the promotion of others in order to facilitate the elimination of that which is seen to be undesirable and regressive. Not then a form of bare life in some legally suspended or abandoned sense of the term, as Agamben would argue, but more accurately, the bare activity of species survival, which, providing for the bare necessities of life, operate within the remit of law. So I think Duffield exposes in perhaps a different and more positive, but no less depoliticising notion of bare life. Now, I think to qualify this slightly, I'm not suggesting you that one needs to dismiss the value of Agamben's work, nor to deny that states of exception exist. I think they will certainly do. But it is to nuance and complement his critique of the exceptional abuse of sovereign power with a critique of the more normalised biopolitics of circulation. Now, to achieve this, then, there is a need to complement his state of exception paradigm with a state of emergency paradigm. There are fundamental differences between the two. And I think this is crucial because not only then can we begin to expose how liberal regimes actually invoke economising notions of freedom and justice in order to strip the potential migrant of any political claims, but also allows us to get a more tangible purchase on how our entire sort of Western, particularly European systems, deny the political asylum of others. So I think that's quite crucial. Now, I think despite the value of Duffield's work, there is, however, a dimension to his, or there is another dimension that's taking place today, which his work, I think, has yet failed to engage with. Because whilst Duffield is right to point out that the 1990s witnessed the onset of this development security nexus, which in practice does work by containing otherwise potentially migrating populations, there is a new dimension which has been added to this, which is obviously completely apt to what's going on in the world today, and that is basically the merger between development, security and the environment. And how each of these is now being brought into one framework for analysis. And this, I suppose, development, security, environment nexus, what I'm in my work called the DESINEX, is certainly finding its policy voice. One, for instance, could look at the United Nations Development Programme 2007 Human Security Report, Fighting Climate Change, Human Solidarity in a Divided World, to see a great and rigorous account of the links between underdevelopment, securitization and the environment. And this has certainly not been lost on the World Bank, because their 2010 World Development Report, titled Development and Climate Change, specifically attends to the interrelated problems of social dislocation, underdevelopment and climate change. As the report indicates, left unmanaged, climate change will reverse development progress and compromise the well-being of current and future generations. What the World Bank therefore calls climate smart development infers policies which have to tackle the inert behaviour of individuals and organisations, with a special emphasis on all manner of unregulated and undocumented activities. So I think the principal message from the World Bank in particular is clear. Bad stewardship of the environment is not only basically wasteful, but it also increases the probability of local forms of violence, which in turn has the potential to contribute to global instability. Now, to my mind, and where my research is currently going, is that this becoming dangerous of the environment, in political terms, poses two rather urgent lines of inquiry. Firstly, it forces us to confront, what actually becomes then of those non-insurable lives, as Mark Duffield calls them, who are in all likelihood going to face at some point a severe environmental event. So what becomes of those non-insurable lives who are at some point in the future going to face some severe environmental event? And secondly, how are we to really understand and critically evaluate the nature of these potential so-called climate wars? So dealing with the first of these, and that is the populations who seem to be at risk from what some would say is certain environmental devastation. It would seem to, that what's on the table at the moment is that there are three possible ways of dealing with the mass exodus populations such a catastrophe would inevitably generate. The first, of course, is a policy of containment. And I think this was, without question, the most favoured policy adopted in New Orleans. The New Orleans case, I think, is important for a number of reasons. Not only did it show how a domestic state of emergency within an advanced liberal society can easily become militarised, but it also illustrated quite clearly how the internal refugee label is invoked specifically to contain undesirable populations from roaming elsewhere. Quite remarkable in the so-called land of the free. And hence, for these populations who apparently came from no-go areas, they found it was them who could not go. This is quite a tragic irony of the New Orleans situation. Now, however, whilst I suppose the people in New Orleans have managed to somehow survive in the face of almost complete government abandon, there is perhaps a more critical problem on the horizon, and that is what happens to those climate change refugees who will be the first to fulfil the classification no way home, the most obvious and impending who being from the Carteret Islands, for instance. And I suppose this brings me to option number 2. Now, without question, if history is our guide, then perhaps the favoured policy choice here would be the creation of new permanent camps to house the permanently displaced, what could actually be termed the climate ghettoisation approach. And I think the Palestinian thus returns here to be an unfortunate standard bearer. And I think, as Zygmunt Bauman has acutely observed, the Palestinian refugee embodies the sans-papier in a world that is otherwise full. Numbering some 3 million, they neatly contained in various refugee camps throughout the Middle East, in a condition which Bauman calls frozen transience, an ongoing or lasting state of temporariness. Thus offering no prospect for escape, their habitual reality is what Bauman calls permanently temporary. Now, of course, the Palestinians are not alone here, and according to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, there are some 13 to 18 million victims of forced displacement living in such permanently temporary conditions. Perhaps there is, I think, a conceptual point of clarification that should be made. I'm not in any way subscribing to the campus nomos hypothesis that Agamben advances, because whilst I appreciate that encamped life certainly exists, I would argue that these archipelagos of containment operate more within a more positive and expansive global system of production. Hence the biopolitics, which I would prefer, is more akin to what Foucault talks about letting things happen and then cancelling out the problem, as opposed to posing the problem and then letting things happen. So I suppose not then a campus nomos, but a nomos of circulation within which certain life is contained. Okay, option number 3. I think given our undoubted contribution to the plight of climate refugees, then arguably the more humane policy option would be the incorporation of these displaced populations into our societies. There is, however, a very clear danger with this assimilation approach. After all, is it ethically right to ask the conformity of others who did not necessarily wish to be incorporated in the first place but had no choice? So I think that again poses some clear problems. So I think given that neither of these policy choices to me seem satisfactory, then I would argue that new thinking is certainly required. And this brings me, I guess, to the title of this sort of session today. And I think surely a first step in this direction is not to question whether or not Europe is under threat from the migrant. Rather, I think it's to understand more rigorously the ways in which notions of threat get constructed, rationalised, lend themselves to policy responses, and ultimately define our relationship with the self and with others. And it is at this stage really that I find increasing value in the work of certain post-structural thinkers, most notably Gilles Deleuze. Now, long before the advent of complexity or network thinking in the social sciences, it was Deleuze who posed the philosophical problem of what it meant to live in dynamic, complex and radically interconnected systems. Indeed, in a manner that is altogether more fitting for our contemporary times, it was Deleuze, perhaps more than anybody else, who challenged us to have a politics which was adequate to what he termed the event. Now, according to Deleuze, what gives an event its eventedness is that, for better or worse, it fundamentally changes the conditions on Earth. Events are thus synonymous with those emergent clashes of forces which create the conditions of the new. Now, of course, there is no conceptual leap of imagination required to see how this event-based thinking can be applied to the problems which I have outlined today. Starting with the advent of modernity itself, it has been those sudden environmental collapses which have proven to be the greatest, or at least the most catastrophic of all evental expressions. Now, importantly for Deleuze, in order for us to have a politics which is truly adequate to the event, in other words, to have a politics which is adequate to that which is to come, then one has to factor in the ethical relations that one has with others who are different. Such relations, he argues, cannot be based upon universal moral foundationalism, a la Immanuel Kant, which tend to problematize rather than reciprocate. Instead, a politics which is adequate to the event demands an altogether more positive attitude that begins by recognizing others are not simply burdened victims, regardless of how awful their plight is. Instead, that they are political subjectivities with different ways of living, needs to be respected and factored in. Okay, just to offer some form of conclusion, I think turning now to this with the potential advent of these so-called climate wars, and the logic here is simple. Not only does poverty now cause conflict, but environmental collapse could lead to sort of, social dislocation and the development, hence exacerbate the causes of conflict. I think, given the genealogy of this, it is impossible to glean some important critical insight from the 1990s security nexus, which at that stage introduced the underdevelopment of the poverty wars. And the logic at work there was simple: to understand the underlying causes of conflict, and hence the fundamental driver of social displacement, one needed to attend to the conditions of social and economic regression. Now, whilst I would argue that the claim that poverty is the principal cause of conflict does not necessarily stand up to rigorous scrutiny, there has unfortunately been a tragic or self-fulfilling prophecy to all this, in the sense that policies of containment and political desubjectivisation have seemingly given new meaning to local violence. And I think this would certainly not have been lost on Hannah Arendt, who not only argued that violence was of a different nature to power, but understood all too well that the capture and depoliticisation of life sparks the most intense violent rage. So with this in mind, I suppose the question that I want to leave you with today, and I suppose a warning as well, is that could it be the case that the newfound commitment to environmentalism will actually begin to sanction new policies of containment, thereby becoming a new self-fulfilling prophecy for rendering dangerous those populations which seek entry into zones of affluence, i.e. Europe, during the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brad and Emilio. Two really, really rich talks, and very much complementary, I think. And one way to touch on that complementary would be to suggest, and then also ask the question. I guess I could ask it first to Brad and then Emilio. How are biometrics implicated in this liberal practice of disciplining, of controlling the circulation of populations that we see in the form of migration. Is that a simple or the only way of governing migrating populations as a threat to the liberal circulation? So to Bradley, I want to pose that question. And then, Emilio, I wanted to ask you, in addition, you talked about how through all times the accepted way of recognizing human beings was through history and culture and telling your story, the genealogy, etc., etc. And then today we're seeing a time where biometrics seems to be the accepted way of recognizing human being. When did that rupture come, and why? Why did that rupture come? Why did we suddenly become convinced that this was the best way to begin to identify each other? Is there a historical conjuncture? Is there a historical rupture of some kind? I don't know that Agamben says anything about this, but I wonder what you think about that. So there are two questions to start things, and then the floor is open. Is there any other comments or questions?
I think the biometric question seems to be quite crucial when we're starting to understand global forms of circulation. And there's a wonderfully rich essay, which some of you might be aware of, which was written by Gilles Deleuze called Postscript on Controlled Societies, where he talks about precisely the shift from the human being human to life as being basically code. And it's life is basically a series of complex algorithms, and depending on not whether you display the right code that you can actually cross the border and so forth, or you have access to different types of gateways. Now, certain authors, I think, really overplay the notion of controlled societies when dealing with zones of underdevelopment and crisis. To talk of a controlled society in certain parts of Africa is completely ludicrous. However, as part of the discussion we had earlier about the border as a body, I think where this notion of controlled society truly matters is when the body of the underdeveloped comes up against the border into advanced liberal societies, and indeed how the body itself then gets animated and problematized at the point of contact, encounter, and point of crossing. And it seems that whilst Emilio sort of talked very richly of the ludicrous nature of seeing biometrics as security technology, it does not mean to say that security agencies are not completely bought into this. And with sometimes disastrous and ludicrous results. But it does seem that I think one of the examples we can perhaps see of an evident sort of testing of this is between the zone of the so-called underdevelopment and a zone of advanced sort of advanced is basically the border crossing between the United States of America and Mexico, where it is this use of biometric technologies, and not which doesn't impinge on the wealthy of Mexico City. They can get fast checkpoints. Their passport is already dictated their identity and so forth. But if you're an indigenous trying to cross and get part-time work in the United States of America, then surely biometrics has quite a clear meaning to you in the sense that it stops you from crossing. So I think there is that the biometric, I guess, then not only serves as a function of allowing people to cross, but it also cancels out particularly the types of people who have no code to speak of, or no productive code in any meaningful sense. So I guess that would be my
Could the liberal society exist without biometrics? Are there other ways of controlling? Has it always been thought as biometric? Determined by biometrics. In other words, does liberal society produce biometrics, or does the course of technology?
Well, no, I think Emilio makes this point quite clearly, is that throughout modern history, there's always been this, this notion of a dialectical other, and I've recently been reading Jacques Derrida's lecture series, The Sovereign and the Beast, which explains this brilliantly. There's this history of dialectical othering, which, where the self is very much formed in relation to the other. But this gives very real, tangible purchase to a meaning of political subjectivity and identity. I think what has taken place today is precisely the on and out of subjectivity, in the sense that when life is reduced to code, there is no subjectivity to speak of. Everything becomes fleeting. Everything becomes, and as Zygmunt Bauman again writes wonderfully on this. That, so whilst I think modern societies have developed without biometrics, what is I think dangerous about biometrics once it becomes aligned with identity politics is that it's precisely the on and out of identities that it can be responsible for.
I think that there are different levels and different issues Because first, we should consider a very easy, understandable fact, which is the huge number of people, of mobile people, for many reasons, the dimension of the world population, the dimension of globalization, and the fact that apart from a small part of the world, which is no more than 1/3 of the world, 2/3 of the world do not have a real sound identification system. Birth registration, and in the West, the way we identify, we ensure identification was set by the French Revolution and was coextensive with liberal democracy, which is the idea that you are defined as a citizen and you don't need any affiliation to religion, to ethnicity, to anything else. You are a French citizen. You just need the place of birth, and that's all. We can have the name of the parents, but actually you are French not because your parents are French. You are French because you was born in France and you chose to be French. This is the beginning. And look, the first law in the West which links birth to identity was enacted 4 years after the French Revolution by the French Parliament. So the identification from the birth registration is exactly part of the Western liberal democratic strategy apparatus. But it's exactly what doesn't work, can't work in 2/3 of the world. In Africa and Asia, you have each year, according to the last figures, UNICEF figures, you have 50 million children not registered at birth. They are the future migrants. They are the future tourists. They are the future warriors of the global civil war. How can you deal with this? And the problem is not a problem of security. It's a problem to give them rights. How can they are not entitled of any rights because you can claim your rights if you have an identity. You can't vote. You can't go to the court. You can't do anything. You can't claim welfare if you don't have an identity. Without an identity, you can't never be anonymous. Even the right to be anonymous is a right that can be enforced only if you have an identity. So this is the challenge. Then there is another consideration. You ask Peter, where is the generation, what the source of this? It is clear. At a certain moment in the West, I would say at the beginning of the last century, we adopted military logistic as a technique to deal with mass society. And this was the apotheosis, the most astonishing example of this was the German Nazi regime. And I repeat, I think that the Nazi regime was the great experiment of modernity. We should spend our lives to study Nazi regime. We are the hero of that. We inherited everything. Our society is the result of the Nazi regime. We are not aware of this, but we are a post-Nazi society. The Nazi society experimented everything, from ecology, macrobiotic food, fitness. We discuss the horrible tattoo in Auschwitz. But how many people know for what it was? You think it was to humiliate people? Look, there was a lot of... there were only in Auschwitz was. In concentration camps, people were not humiliated? Huh? Do you think what was not enough, what happened in concentration camps? Did you ever read Primo Levi's? Huh? No, tattoos was not. You know the reason of tattoos? Because in German bureaucracy, read Max Weber. Max Weber is a crucial thinker to be studied. In the German bureaucracy, they need to register any person who entered should be in or be out. When you die, you are out. But if you die and you are not recognized, they can't discharge your name and remain a file open. Emilio Mordini. Where is Emilio Mordini? Oh, he died. Who can testify? Who can witness? My file in my book is open. I have to close the book. So they had the idea. Put the tattoo. You can recognize corpse. Even if they die, you recognize them and you can close the file. Was the schizophrenia, the psychosis of bureaucracy. This is the origin of tattoo. And you should think of this. Because bureaucracy, we live in the same bureaucracy. IBM, which gave the infrastructure to the Nazi regime for the census, is the same IBM today. I repeat, we should study the Nazi regime. It was the great rehearsal of modernity.
Comments? On that? Sounds like the end of the lecture series. What? Yeah, please.
Yeah, but okay. One thing. Who are the migrants? If you want to take the migrants, we know that most of the migrants arrive to Europe, so are Europeans relevant? Are people that are very well identified in their place because generally have a higher education and so on?
Can you speak louder?
We know that most of the migrants that are coming to Europe or that are EU relevant in the sense that it becomes a political problem for us, if you want me to be cynic, are people that are with high level skills, so are very well recognized by their home country and they want to lose their identity to avoid problems later. So I don't see exactly the nexus between children that are not registered at birth and migrants for Europe. In the sense that they are migrants, but they are migrants within Africa, they are migrants elsewhere. And they are not going to have right even if they are identified. But the lecture last week of Gas Hussein, like, speaking exactly on this ambiguity of registering against which kind of right, against the right to have the same food that you already had. So it's not so sure. So I think that we have to a little bit contextualize when you speak about that. And also this link between identity, welfare, and biometrics is not so clear for me, because I think that except some bad social scientists, quite nobody made the link between body and mind throughout biometrics. Biometrics are much more seen as danger when we think about as a key, as something that helps you or helps someone in a power relation with you to construct, to build on your biography. And so the problem was, how can I ensure that I'm part of my biography? And so I'm not so sure. And also the time span is important. I think that, yes, yeah, my fingerprints, a lot of my biometrics things will change. There is this philosophical idea that everything changes, but in the immediate, I have consequence on the fact that someone in a power relation with me is able to give me some effect, put me in a camp, put me under control, and so on. It will not last for the eternity, okay, I'm sure, but for the moment it matters. And I don't see how, and that's the question, multi-biometrics and so on will change. And on the origins, I think that there are other origins before Nazi regimes that are interesting. Bertillonage in France, it's a massive use of biometrics. Lombroso in Italy, that was someone that was socialist progressist but was following our Piemontese troop to measure corps and so on, to try to find consistency and so on. So I think that when we speak about that, there is also a charge of symbolism and political symbolism that we have to take into account and make the shortcut between Neoplatonic attribute of biometrics and modernity. I'm not sure that is completely sincere. You know me, so I'm very...
Can I just reply briefly? I understand what you mean, but just let me tell you two things. First, I have always a suspect of a sort of frivolity, a frivolous scholar way of... I am the first to be frivolous. I like frivolous arguments. But I understand that there is something wrong. If I speak to migrants in an Italian camp, or even illegal migrants with no problem, racism, xenophobia in Italy, but in Germany or in France as well, and I tell him or her, your problem is that we are going to erase your biography. He starts laughing. It's not his problem, to be honest. He has a lot of problems, but that one is erasing his biography. I understand what is the general... It is true. It is true that the way in which large-scale movement of people have managed is as though they were beasts, they were animals. But you don't need biometrics. The problem is that how you can handle with the great, with huge mobile population without treating them as beasts. And you don't need biometrics. It is enough to go to any... I was in Heathrow 1 week ago. And the way in which officers asked people in the queue to put off their shoes was outrageous. It was a way in which not even a capo in a concentration camp could do this. They were completely rude. The problem is that, and I understand why. Because they are putting people in a feeling of minority, in a feeling of subjection. So each one respects the queue, no one protests, everything follow the rules. I understand, this is very understandable. But this is the point. And you can use biometrics, you can use shouting, you can use any technology or not technology. The point is that how you can handle with the huge mobile population, treating them as human beings, respecting their rights. Then biometrics is a secondary problem, I think. Okay, that's all.
I just want to come back, I guess, to the question. I think it's right to say, well, what actually is a right? And I think that needs to be explored a lot more critically. I think we've far too got hung up on the notion that rights are something enshrined in law or something which is universally declared. And I think, again, I return to Derrida here. He says, there's nothing about universal rights, just tell you about particular injustices. And I think one example I could perhaps use then to highlight one of my concerns between this merger between development, security and the environment, and how I see this playing out in policy terms. Part of my sort of previous research, I spent about 3 years in Mexico, largely sort of researching with the Zapatistas. And the Zapatistas, as you may be aware, are sort of an autonomous indigenous community in Mexico, which occupy a sort of an autonomous region in the Lacandona valleys, and it's basically one of the only areas in Mexico where you can build further dams. Now, if you consider in the entire NAFTA region, which is in America, sort of, United States, that's America, Canada, and Mexico, this is the only place where basically 70% of the region's rainfall. Then this raises problems about accessibility to water. Now, perhaps we could argue in the human security discourse there is no greater right than the right to drinking water. But water, of course, in this region is a scarce resource. And recently, as part of the NAFTA provisions, the United States of America, the most polluted country on earth, has labelled Mexican water part of its national security. So, where does the right to this come in? Is it the Zapatistas' right to indigenous autonomy? Is it the United States' right to drinking water? And I think we have to, I suppose, be a bit more aware of the power dynamics at play when we simply say right. I think it's too easy for us to pass this off as simply devoid of point. But I do want to come back then, I suppose, in defence of Emilio's point about there is a need for much more rigorous study of the legacy of Nazism. And this is something which I am working on. It's about an edited volume on the contemporary manifestations of fascism. And again, this is not aligned with some suicidal death state, or even indeed in these Agamben type appropriations of US exceptionalism as being fascism and so forth. But it's in the more mundane bureaucracy in which fascism thrives. And I think one only has to read Arendt's Eichmann on Trial to see the complete banality of this. But this is the raw end of fascist power. It is the simple end of fascist power, and as you're right to point out, read Primo Levi. This is, the simple sort of logic of this. And also I think Bauman's book Modernity and the Holocaust really tackles this great as well. And if you can ever tackle such a topic, great. But it is the more mundane which demands greater treatment and more sympathetic treatment from us, rather than just the grand sort of suicidal aspects. So yeah, okay.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Well, I have plenty. And could I ask Brad, you to go back to the distinction between bare life in Agamben and bare life in Duffin, and ask you then whether we can link this to two different understandings of biometrics, or biometric thinking, or sort of the alienation of the self from the body. Could you explain a bit that distinction?
Yeah. Okay. Well, if we take then Agamben's assumption of bare life first, Agamben aligns bare life firmly with notions of sovereign power, juridical power, i.e. the life which becomes bare is the life which is abandoned from the sovereign order, from the sovereign realm, in whatever way, shape or form. And hence, it is the exceptional status of the body which invokes exceptional conditions, hence, the life can get stripped of any moral and political claim, they have no juridical status, they have no identity as such, and they're abandoned beyond the realm. And I think, in that sense, I suppose, I don't think biometrics really has any tangible purchase other than the fact that it's precisely those people we don't want to be part of society. And hence, we can apply this narrative to, for instance, the enemy combatant in Guantanamo, or whatever. These are the people who, we want to sort of, exist beyond the realm, although perhaps, they will, be succumbed to the latest technologies now they occupy prisons in Illinois, as opposed to being, on an island safely secluded. I think what Duffield's work only really alludes to, and I think it's something which is perhaps more, being picked up by people such as Brian Masumi, who coins this notion of bare activity as opposed to bare life. And that is a notion of, what is the difference between a state of exception and a state of emergency? Well, whereas a state of exception makes sort of clear distinctions between them and us, inside, outside, those who belong, those who don't, a state of emergency is very much an internal problem. It is precisely problematization of those lives which exist within any given society. Now, of course, I think there are a lot of supplementary qualifications to this, in the sense that we could say, well, in many senses, a lot of the problems which concern us in a liberal state of emergency are people who do exist beyond liberal societies. But I think liberalism itself instantly adopts a global imaginary. So by their very nature, they are always already included. And I think what is different then about a state of emergency, particularly in advanced societies, and as the etymological term would suggest, what concerns us is precisely that which emerges within a state of emergency. It's what we don't know in a society of complex, dynamic social interactions. And indeed, it's, this is the central point of Macdillan's work, it's that which emerges becomes the new security concern for the biopolitical technologies of emergence. So, we control circulations, we securitize it, we problematize it. We now have a shift in particularly in terrorist thinking towards event-based analysis. And I suppose then, so I would see biometrics working in this as part of a technology which is equally bound to the reduction of life to mere technology. And you can look at this globally, locally, within metropolitan districts of the world. And so I suppose what I'm looking at then, the bare activity, which is, I suppose, more in line with that field's concern with the liberal problematic of security, deals precisely with the depoliticization and effectively the hollowing out of the human within the remit of advanced societies, not simply just by abandoning life and saying it has no political or moral value. And of course, the use of technologies is implicit very much in this.
And, if I can comment your considerations, I think that what is interesting is that Agamben is using one of the early Carl Schmitt analysis, which is based on the post-First World War situation. As a matter of fact, if you read the late Carl Schmitt about the partisan war theory, what is exactly the corresponding event to the state of exception and state of emergency, which is the reality on the globalized world. In a globalized world, you can't have any longer the state of exception because the nation states are failing. You have the globalized power, which need emergency states.
Yeah, no, I think there's 2 points I want to come back to that. And as I mentioned, I've written a few articles on the shift, for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan from a paradigm of exceptionalism, i.e. terrorists, to a paradigm of emergency, which is the emergency caused by populations, i.e. insurgents. Now, this is by no means radically new. It has a history to this, and and the states of exception always seem to preclude states of emergency, and I think Schmitt is precisely right on this point. And I also think Agamben, to his credit, is fully aware of this, and this very much comes through in his work on notions of what is an apparatus, the divine economy, and so forth. And I think Agamben's work sometimes suffers simply from a very selective appropriation of his work. And particularly liberals jump onto the state of exception paradigm to justify their critique of realism, but they no way engage in biopolitics because it poses fundamental problems for liberals. So I think whilst then it's easy to I suppose focus on the compartmentalized mentality of this old sovereign model, as you're right to point out, this belongs to an outdated past. Although there is a sort of a genealogy of the shift from exception to emergency, which permeates all societies. And I think this is where you come back to Foucault when he says, sovereign power and biopolitics, they're not in competition. They always work with one another. And exceptions and emergencies are very contingent and they operate in different moments in time.
You know what is, for instance, one very interesting technology, which is exactly the demonstration, the practical demonstration of what you said. Google Flu. And apart from Google Flu, there are other similar. You know that there are a series of browsers, like Google, which are studying, an ongoing monitoring of words related to certain particular emergency state. In the case of Google Flu is monitoring a thesaurus of terms, and even in the next future also of videos, images, related to the flu epidemics. The theory is, which lies behind, is that people start searching in the internet when the first symptoms appear, well before symptoms arrive to the observation of the public health system. So you can detect epidemics, but you can use this model also for financial crisis or political crisis. You can detect epidemics well in advance. And this model, surprisingly enough, works. They detected the Mexico epidemics of avian flu more than 1 week in advance of the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control. This is exactly the global technology for emergency. And what is amusing, at least from a scholarly point of view, amusing, is that everything is blurred in the same salad bowl. Terrorism, epidemics, earthquakes, tsunamis, everything. No differences.
Right. I think we'll round off here. Unless there's something burning your lips. We're now moving into the next phase of this project, the project which is the Threat Against Europe, which is the book project. So now there'll be a book emerging from most of these lectures, not all of them perhaps, but most of them. And that book will become available, I suppose, in about 1 year's time. And there'll also be some sort of announcement on the IES webpage about the publication of this book. And of course, there'll be a launch to which you are all welcome now, 1 year in advance, invited to the launch of the book. Thanks for your participation all through this semester. You were actually the loyal ones. We started many more, but of course the semester is long and life is short and all the rest. Thanks also to our two speakers, and we'll see you around. Thanks.